So this week we are talking about the first part of A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind by Harriet A. Washington. So let's break down some of the main concepts that are happening in the first part of the book. So in the preface, Washington adds some information about COVID-19. This book came out in 2019, but obviously COVID-19 had a huge impact racially and socially. And so she does add that preface, which gives us a good introduction to the rest of the book, including the introduction, which is about IQ matters. And so Harriet A. Washington begins in this section of the book to set up some of the arguments that she will be talking about for the rest of the book. So the rest of the book is much like Silent Spring, going to discuss specific issues, but some of these concepts are going to weave their way through all of these issues. So one thing that she talks about is the failure to use the precautionary principle. So this is the idea that we in the United States specifically tend to do things backwards from what Europeans and a lot of other nations do, which is if we don't know about a substance or a pesticide or any sort of potentially hazardous industry, agricultural means, something like that, we use it and then we see what happens. While others subscribe to the precautionary principle is that they study it, and then decide if it's safe. And this has been very, very problematic for the United States, the failure to use the precautionary principle. And Washington will spend much of the book describing this problem. The subject of the book, Washington points out on page 9, and that is the specific, devastating, and all but unregarded injury that environmental poisoning inflicts on communities of color, the loss of intelligence, and the malignant flowering of behavioral problems that destroy lives and human potential as effectively as cancer and lung disease, but with fewer alarms raised. So this book is an alarm for the issues that have gone unnoticed. And the book does focus on environmental racism specifically, and communities of color. However, Washington points out that many communities are going to be impacted, including poor whites. However, she also discusses that the data is insufficient to describe these populations, mostly because a lot of data is done across racial lines instead of socioeconomic lines. And so when you're looking at something like poor whites, that is not going to factor into the majority of the white population in the way that looking at a Hispanic or a Black population disaggregated from the data would. So she does in some sections still talk about issues and the history of whiteness and what was considered ethnic whiteness, because she points out that race is a social construct much more than it is a biological construct, and that for a long time, poor whites were seen as ethnically different from the rest of white people, Irish people, Italian people. And so a lot of these issues are going to impact these communities too. But she points out that the immeasurable losses are really inflicted on communities of color. And so that's the focus of the book. She also talks about sacrifice zones. So this term comes up a few times. And sacrifice zones are the areas where the runoff, the dumping, the hazardous material, military waste, whatever it might be, wherever it needs to go, it has to go somewhere. And so it's sacrificed into these areas that are predominantly areas of color. And then Washington points out on page 13, another kind of thesis point of the book, a terrible thing to waste explains that establishing convincing proof, which is often presented as a purely scientific question, is very often an economic and political strategy deployed by industry and or government to evade responsibility. So a lot of these concepts, as a scientist, Washington is going to talk about how environmental hazards impact the body and specifically the brain. So it is very much a scientific and biological book. But she also points out that we can't act as if this is just purely science and not connected to economic and political realities. So then in chapter 1, Washington does background on how politics shroud the truth about our nation's IQ. So this is a really interesting and thorough background on what IQ is, what it means, how IQ has been applied to different groups of people throughout history, and how the concept of IQ in itself is problematic, how it's a tool that was used throughout history, and much like other tools that we're finding now, like IQ or BMI or these different types of tools, they were applied for like a very specific context, but then really picked up steam and somehow everyone's using them, even if it's not in the appropriate context. And so she talks about IQ being true this way as well. And so the history of IQ is in here. I pulled out one quote because much of what this chapter does is going to talk about how IQ is misused, but there is a part where Washington says, so what do we do now? We need some sort of definition of intelligence, and she will use IQ as a tool to try to talk about these topics. But she says intelligence is an emergent property of mental functioning. So how we actually measure this is very difficult. It's very problematic. It's very cultural. It's very political. But we can at least agree that intelligence is an emergent property of mental functioning. So this is part 1 of the book. It will set us up to get into the other chapters that will talk about issues more specifically, to try to understand what environmental racism means and how it is impacting our country.